Josephine Butler, remembered 30th of May. On the 30th of May, the Church of England remembers principally two figures in the history of the Church. St. Joan of Arc, the spirited Maid of Orleans, canonised as a saint in 1922, and Josephine Butler, who is not a saint. Josephine Butler is more obscure. She was the middle-class wife of a well-to-do Victorian parson, a campaigner for social rights and improvements in the lives of the poor. Josephine Butler is, on the surface, an amusing figure, a Victorian middle-class do-gooder, complete in many photographs with reproachful scowl, oceans of crinoline, and extravagant hats heavy on the lace and taxidermy. But she devoted her life to the service of others. Born Josephine Elizabeth Gray in 1828, she was the daughter of Hannah and John Gray of Northumberland, and distantly related to a British Prime Minister, Lord Grey. As she and her siblings grew up, they were exposed to the reforming friends of the family, who campaigned for the abolition of slavery, the end of the Corn Law, and Catholic emancipation. Along with strong social and political ideas, the young Josephine was raised in the context of a strong faith. This did not prevent her going through her own crisis of faith, however, at the age of 17. It is thought that this stemmed from an incident in which she encountered the remains of someone who had committed suicide whilst she was out riding. She became disenchanted with her weekly church attendance, describing the local vicar as, quote, "an honest man in the pulpit, who taught us loyally all that he probably himself knew about God, but whose words did not even touch the fringe of my soul's deep discontent." She began in her prayers to purposefully speak directly to God. As she later wrote, "I spoke to him in solitude, as a person who could answer. Do not imagine that on these occasions I worked myself into any excitement. There was much pain in such an effort, and dogged determination required. Nor was it a devotional sentiment that urged me on. It was a desire to know God and my relation to him." In 1852, she married cleric and Oxford academic George Butler. The couple initially lived in Oxford, where their first two sons were born. They shared a strong faith, commitment to social reform, and a love of Italian culture. It is probably fair to say that Josephine did not overly enjoy her time in Oxford. Often the only woman at social gatherings, she disliked what she saw as misogyny and an acceptance of double standards at the university. She decided, she said, to speak little with men and much with God. The Butlers began to help many of the fallen women in Oxford and invited some to live in their house. One notable case involved a young woman serving a prison sentence at Newgate Prison. She had been seduced by a university don, who had subsequently abandoned her. The woman had murdered her baby in despair. The Butlers contacted the governor of Newgate to arrange for her to stay in their house at the end of her sentence. Finding that the damp atmosphere in Oxford was hurting her health, following the advice of doctors, George bought a house for them near Bristol, before moving again when George Butler was made Vice Principal of Cheltenham College. In 1866, he was made head of Liverpool College, and they moved again. Josephine began her work in the local workhouses in Liverpool, where she would visit the women residents. With her husband, she soon began to open up their home to destitute women, many of whom were, or had been, prostitutes. When space ran out, they opened a shelter for them. From these dealings with what many felt was the seedier underbelly of society sprang the great campaign that would define her life and future reputation. The Contagious Diseases Act was a particularly repellent piece of legislation. It victimized women in general and the poor in particular. To safeguard the health of the Army and Navy, it allowed for unaccompanied women to be arrested by police or women found in specific areas, or if they were suspected prostitutes. No evidence was required, just the suspicion of the constabulary. They were then detained so that they could be checked for venereal disease. This was often distressing, and many examinations were carried out publicly. If the women were found to have a disease, they were held in a lock hospital until it was cured. If they refused to be examined, they could be imprisoned with hard labour. The intended victims were local prostitutes. However, when more respectable middle-class women were also arrested, campaigners against the act found public opinion increasingly on their side. Butler toured the country, travelling 3,700 miles to attend 99 meetings. Many working-class men were outraged by the act and supported the work of Butler and others. At many meetings, however, she was attacked by local pimps who would throw cow dung, smash windows, or threaten to burn the venue. At one meeting, she was even chased by local brothel owners. Following political action, Parliament felt forced to set up an inquiry, and Butler gave evidence. One committee member said of her testimony, "I am not accustomed to religious phraseology, but I cannot give you an idea of the effect produced except by saying that the Spirit of God was there." However, this inquiry did not propose a change to the law, and it was not repealed. It was eventually abolished when Gladstone became PM in the 1880s. A friend of the Butlers, he also opposed the law. During this time, Josephine Butler also campaigned for women's suffrage, better education for women, and access for women to higher education, a wider range of employment, and for married women to be able to maintain ownership of their own property and individual legal rights. In 1868, she petitioned Cambridge to permit women to enter examinations at the university, which was allowed the following year. And in 1882, the Married Women's Property Act became law. In the course of journeys to Europe, Josephine Butler discovered a thriving trade in child prostitution alive in Britain and on the continent. Her work in this area led eventually to new laws to protect children, most still actively enforced today. A string of charitable homes were established, along with the sacking and imprisonment of the head and deputy head of the Belgian police force for trafficking in child prostitutes. She was also involved in the shocking investigation by William Stead, which led to the raising of the age of consent in Britain from 13 to 16. Butler, however, disliked the activity of purity societies which were being founded at the time, as she did not believe that they were right in their assumption that morality could be imposed by force. Butler has been condemned recently for not opposing British imperial policy and not sharing in some of the colonial campaigns of her friends. During the Boer War, she wrote, regarding the casual racism she was encountering, "Race prejudice is a poison which will have to be cast out if the world is ever to be Christianized." Josephine Butler died in Northumberland in 1906. Although included in a number of memorials, Josephine Butler remains more obscure than Joan of Arc. She is, perhaps, less striking than the pure maid in shining armour, living a life in blood, sent to the stake, persecuted, certain, steadfast. This is the stuff that church windows are made of, but not life. Josephine Butler, for all her crinoline and high Victorian ephemera, plunged into the mud, muck and mire of everyday life, firmly resolved to help those less fortunate, less privileged, to be a servant of all, to be more than a potted biography of another worthy, to be an example to us all today. Josephine Butler is remembered by the Church of England on the 30th of May.